Hello and welcome to Power BI at Work. My name is Mark Walter. I have been teaching foundations and DAX for 2.5 years now. I've been using Power BI pretty consistently for the last 10 years. My teaching partner's name is Michael Hewitt. He also joins me in teaching foundations and DAX. And the purpose of this video today is to just provide a sample of some of the lectures that you could expect in our foundations course. With this video, we're just going to focus a little bit on row versus filter context. And being a finance background Excel guy, I like to approach this from an Excel perspective. I like teaching row context and filter context from Excel and then transitioning directly into Power BI. I'm also a fan of learning off of mini models. And so you can see here with this spreadsheet that we have a transaction table here, and then we've got these other tables off to the side that in Power BI would represent dimension tables or lookup tables. But in Excel, this might replicate something that we would manually prepare every month and create a pivot report for managers. So we're going to go through row and filter context here just briefly and then transition into Power BI. So as we can see here, we've got our main transaction table. We've got a number of transactions made by customers. Customers are buying parts with different part numbers. They're buying quantities, and this export of data that we have has quantity and unit price. If I want to, from a Excel perspective, create a report of total sales, I'm going to have to create a column here that expresses total sales, unit price times quantity. And so what I'm going to do here is just create a formula and multiply quantity times unit price. And you'll notice that the moment I hit return, it automatically fills in all of the total sales. It does this because it knows that what I'm asking for it to do is go one row at a time and do this quantity times unit price. And you can see it here in the formula where we've got quantity, the column quantity times unit price. And that's all I'm referencing here. So row context in this case, also in Power BI, would operate just by default in a table environment. And we'll talk about that more when we're in Power BI. But in this table, you can see all I'm referencing, of course, is column references, but it knows to go row by row. And that's how I'm getting this result. This is referred to as row context, and it's easy for us Excel people to see it happen here. We're very accustomed to this math just automatically happening, whether it's in a table or we write it once and then we double click and then expect it to just follow suit. All right, so we've got row context. I've also got other lookups here because I'm not in Power BI. I don't have these connected to this transaction table. But what I can do in Excel, of course, is use the XLOOKUP function and look up over these other tables that I may be importing into my spreadsheet and use them to bring back all of this information into one nice big table. This is not a practice that we're going to do in Power BI, but we are going to use this in Excel to go from this total sales calculation we just did to an aggregation of that total sales that we see here in this visual that's awaiting our pivot. So we'll see that, well, let me stretch this out just a little bit. You'll see that I have my visual here, and I'm just going to bring in the vendor to the rows and the description of the product into the rows as well. And then as far as this total goes, if we were in Power BI, we could just grab the total sales column and bring it in here and be able to see our totals by vendor, by product type. But in Power BI, we're going to learn very quickly that best practice isn't to bring in this column, but rather to write a measure. And the best way that I can illustrate the concept of a measure here in Excel is just to create a sum of this column. So you'll notice that this grand total is not attached to the column or to the table in any way. Same with a measure in Power BI. It's somewhat of just this floating aggregation that's out, that's a part of the model because it's using DAX, but it's not attached physically to a table. In Power BI, what we would do with this measure is we would use this as a field that we would see over here, and we would just drag it in, and it would have the same effect of aggregating by vendor, by product type, and let's add month, year into our columns there. So we're adding more filters to our pivot table. But what we'll learn in Power BI is when you start bringing this measure into the visual on the front of the Power BI canvas, what you're triggering is called filter context. And understanding that this is row context that we did over here, but also understanding that when we're in the visual and we've got all these labels acting as filters, what brings the right aggregation back per cell in this visual is in fact called filter context. So as we go through our course, we're going to hammer on this a lot. When do we have filter context? When do we have row context? Because understanding by looking at your DAX or considering the environment that you're in, whether it be the visual or in the model tables, it's going to become very important for us to know when to expect row context, when to expect filter context, and when to mix them together. That's the key to progressing in DAX right there. So that's from the Excel side. We're now going to save our progress, and we're going to go into Power BI where I've prepped this already. And we're going to see those same tables in a Power BI from a Power BI perspective. All right. So all I did was bring in those mini model tables, those very small tables into Power BI. We've got a table for fact table. You can see that we've got all of our transactions there, just as we did in Excel. Okay. We've got month, year. That was a lookup. Let's go into Power Query and kind of undo some of this stuff because I don't want. One thing that we're going to learn in Power BI real fast is that the spirit of Power BI is less is more. So where we needed all of that information in the same table, we do not need that same information here in Power BI. So I've opened up Power Query, which is the initial program that allows you to ingest or import your data, but it also lets you clean columns up that aren't necessary. And we'll see why in a second. But I already know, because I have customer number in here, which is right there, I don't need to repeat name. Okay. My customer number is a unique field in the customer table. So is SKU. And so I don't need to show the vendor here in the sales table. I don't need to show the description here. I also don't need month, year, because I've got transaction date there, and that's going to connect to my date table. I'm going to delete total sales, or not. Sorry, we're not deleting. We're just removing columns. That's one thing that's nice about Power Query is that in Excel, we'd call that deleting columns. But in Power Query, it maintains the integrity of the original data source. And here, we're just simply hiding it before importing it into Power BI. So we've got all of our same columns as we originally did in that Excel workbook until we started doing X lookups. And now what I'm going to do is just close and apply, and it's going to convert what we see here. This table is going to change and be pared down to just the information that we need for this model. You'll see in the model view that something that's different from Excel is that I'm able to connect my lookup tables or my dimension tables to my sales fact table. And this is satisfying every X lookup I might want to do. So there's no need in Power BI to do VLOOKUPs, X lookups. Once you establish these relationships like this, and you can establish the direction of the flow of the filters, that's all we really need to do to satisfy any lookups. Because when we make our visual, we're using fields from these tables to define rows and columns. And then we're going to write a measure over sales, and we're going to see that same table as we did in Excel. So, but before we do that, we need to go back to our sales table, and we need to create a calculated column. And I'm just doing this for education. As we go through the course, we're going to learn that it's not necessarily best practice to create a calculated column. But since we're demonstrating row in filter context, I want to show row context here by creating this calculated column. As we had mentioned, we're in a table environment. And so we know that the default context is row context. So exactly like I had done in Excel, I'm able to say total sales. And so I'm naming my column to the left of the equal sign. And then it's exactly like that table expression that we did in Excel, where I'm going to say quantity times unit price. And you'll notice that we're referencing the table name here in Power BI, but then here's that column reference. And here's the other one. And just like in that Excel table, when I hit enter, I should expect this automatic behavior to play out. And so I've got quantity times unit price there. Again, not best practice. We'll learn other ways of doing this. Best practice would be to call my IT friend and have them bake this into the original data source. But there are other steps that we can take before we do something like this. But that's a demonstration of row context. Now we're going to go from the table view to the canvas view that holds our visuals. And instead of a pivot table here, I'm going to create what's called a matrix in Power BI. You just create the visual like that. You put it on the canvas. It's very similar to a pivot table in Excel, but it's specific to Power BI. I'm just going to create the same pivot type visual. But before I do that, I remember that I need to go to that timetable and I need to create my month year column. I'm going to go back into Power Query, just take out that column that I created in Excel. What I got used to very early on is not trying to establish my month year column here on the import and bring it in. And And that is because oftentimes when it comes into Power BI, it tries to, like you saw, format that as a date, when in fact, I don't, excuse me, I don't need a date there. I just need the text, month and year. So let's try something. Let's just create a column in Power Query that's going to combine month and year. If I go up to add columns and I come here to merge columns, I should be able to merge these. Into a nice column. And I should be able to force this as text, and you can see it formatted this as text already. So we're just going to leave it like that. That's text, that's a whole number, and that's a date. So that's an example of creating a column in Power Query through merge columns. Let's see what happens when we bring it into Power BI. Let's see if it comes in as text, and it does. That's good. All right. Let's format this as a date. Let's change this format. This is my timetable. This is good. And then I'll come back to my canvas and we're back to our matrix visual. All right. Now, what's different about this is I'm going to use for the rows and the columns of this table, instead of using the one table, the one transaction table, I'm going to have to use the other related tables, the lookup tables, to create this visual. So what I'm going to do is put the vendor and the description of the parts there. And then I'm going to put up in the columns my month year. And you can see my transactions, or my date table, only spans January and February since it's a mini model. So of course, I'm only going to see January and February. Now, normally in the pivot table, you would come to this mini sales fact table and you just pull in this column. And you can do that here too as well. And you can see that it works pretty nicely. Let me increase the values here, the size of this thing. Okay. And then we can increase the row headers as well. Just make this a little bigger for us. All right. So the reason why I don't want to do that, other than it just not being best practice, is that I lose the ability to be able to reuse this column reference, right? I pulled this in here once. Well, every time I need total sales, I'm going to have to pull it in again. So if I create a measure and say we're creating like a margin calculation where it's sales minus cost, I'm going to have to reference this column again. But instead of doing that, if I take that sum of the column out and I specifically come in here and add a measure, and remember when we were in Excel, a measure conceptually was like a column aggregation at the bottom of our table. Not physically connected to a table, but this idea of this sum aggregation. I'm going to do the same thing here, and just so we know that it's separate from that column, let's call it total sales measure. And because we already have that column, that calculated column that used row context to multiply quantity times unit price, now all I need to do in my measure is sum that column, sum that multiplied column, quantity times unit price. So I'm just going to do this, and it's going to look almost exactly like that grand total in Excel. But let's sum that total column that total sales column, and you can see again, it referenced the table name and the column, right? But this time we're aggregating that column just like we did in Excel, and we're creating a specific measure for it. You'll see that when I hit enter, and you see the placeholder right there where it says measure. Well, you see this calculator icon that specifies that I have created a DAX element within my model, even though it's not a column and it's not attached back here at all in my sales table. We don't see that measure anywhere, but I know that it's right here and it represents an aggregation or a total of that column. Now, all I need to do now is drag this into the values box. Again, so much like pivot, right? And we get the same result as we saw in Excel. Let's open up Excel. Let's see if that pops open again. If we can just compare. So that is how row context, filter context, that's how I describe them in Excel. But as we're going to see, filter context has a very, very specific job in our visual. When we were in Excel and we pulled that column in because we couldn't write a measure, what we saw in that pivot table was that every cell in this pivot table was returning a different total. And in Excel, we kind of take this for granted. If we said that this is returning 100 because this table was filtered for that cell down to that row right there, we wouldn't be surprised, right? Matter of fact, we could double click on that cell and actually see that filtered row pop out. It could be more than one row, but it's what defines that aggregation are those filtered rows in that table. Well, it's really no different in Power BI. And so let's go back to Power BI. Let's see if we can't isolate our little table here, right? Have them kind of both show at the same time. No difference, or at least there shouldn't be. We've got a grand total of 686 in both, and here's that same field, $100. Now, what's different about filter context back here in Power BI? Let's reduce this and let's just take a look at this. We've got a very similar visual here, and we've got the amount or our measure here that we use, total sales measure, being filtered or divvied out by vendor, by product description, and month, year. With filter context here, it's a little more complicated than a single table in Excel. But what's basically happening here is we're going back to this model and we're taking these labels that came from our visual. Let's go back to our visual, sorry, real quick. This $100 right there is looking out at all of the items that will define what will become this amount. And what it's doing is it's looking to the left and saying, well, I see vendor is BASF, product description is car wipes. But then I look up here and I see that this cell is also defined by February 2025. And so without this total known just yet, filter context is triggered here by default. When we were in that table, row context evaluated one row at a time. Well, on the canvas here, it's filter context that is our default. And what's happening is it's collecting or scooping up all these labels, BASF, car wipes, February 2025, and it's going back to the source of those labels, which are now up here in these tables. And it's filtering this part table down for vendor is BASF. The product description is car wipes. And so you can imagine if we only have one part in this table that meets that criteria, BASF and car wipes, this is only going to be, let me get out of this. This is only going to be a 1-row table after it filters down. But then once this is filtered, it's going to send that filter down through our table, through the SKU, or here the part number, and it's going to repeat that same filter here. So what we're going to end up with this first filter are all the products sold that were vendor BASF, and the part is car wipes. But we had another filter, and it was from our timetable. And so there's going to be another filter coming down here. And as we go back to our visual, we can see that for this cell, it's February 2025. But here, we're going to now filter this field for February 25. This table is only going to contain the rows that satisfy the month of February 2025, which is going to be 28, unless it was a leap year. And then through the date column, which is the unique key that ties or that relates this table to our sales, through this date key, we're going to send that filter down of all those dates in February 2025 and filter this accordingly. So this table for that cell in that visual is going to only show us rows where BASF car wipes were sold in February 2025. Once this is all filtered, and this is called propagation of filters, once we propagate all our filters and the model is reduced, then the very last step is that our measure, which is defined as sum over total sales, this is the last step. Once the model's filtered, the sum kicks in. And we get the result for that cell, 100. Why is it 100? Because those are the only rows showing in the model at that time. So that's the concept of filter context. And we're going to learn a lot about row and filter context because, as I mentioned, understanding that filter context lives on the canvas by default, understanding that row context happens automatically when we create, whether it's a virtual calculated column or it's an actual calculated column like this, row context lives here. And as we learn about writing more and more complex DAX measures, we're going to see how row and filter context interact together. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this was helpful. Please reach out to us. If you have any questions about our course, you can find our course on storybi.com, which is my blog site, or we also have the URL or the website Power BI at Work, which will take you to the same place. But please reach out to us with questions. We offer a foundations course that goes through everything from Power Query and importing data to cleaning data, loading it, compressing it, writing DAX, creating a star schema model, and then we go on to creating visuals and then telling a effective data story in the Power BI service. That's our foundations course. And then if you love DAX, after that, if you still want to learn more about DAX, we offer leveling up in DAX as well, where those sessions are specifically about really solidifying evaluation context, and then going beyond to fully understand the steps to calculate. DAX is a query language, not just a functional language. And then a whole bunch of tips and tricks that will make your reports that much more powerful for your user. So please reach out to us. And again, thank you for watching this video, and we'll see you next time. All right. See ya.